also within your brainstem are the nuclei of some of your cranial, actually all your cranial nerves are somewhere within your brainstem here. So this brings us into our next topic, our cranial nerves. Right? And in your slides, you only have a couple of them, but I'm going to kind of talk about a little extra few of them right there and a little bit of background, right? So for those, right, you have this chart in there that's, this gives you pretty much what you need to know about the cranial nerves, right? And I'll talk to you about a couple of tricks to remember them. So you're going to have to not only identify them on that brain model, but you're going to have to remember that cranial nerve 4 is the trochlea, and it's involved in eye movement of some sort, right? Or that cranial nerve number 9 is the glossopharyngeal, involved in, some kind of salivary gland secretion. Right? This is even a little more detailed than you maybe need to know. It's very basic as far as the function. So we're going to go over little tricks, little mnemonics and stuff like this dumb one over here, or other ones that you could look up online and find a way to remember that, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations sound heavenly. There's a bunch of X-rated ones you can learn by Googling it, or the one I learned in grad school was On Old Olympus's Towering Tops, a Fin and, because this is used to be called the acoustic, German viewed some hops, right? So you could learn whatever one that you actually remember, right? To remember the names of these. And then there's another one to remember what this is, right? So let's go back to your spinal nerves for a second. Remember your spinal nerves and your spinal cord, they were covering a certain area of your body, right? The dermatomes of each specific spinal segment went out and innervated both the skin, right? Picking up information from the skin, and then the muscles underneath, right? The spinal nerves, that was just the bundles of axons. And we saw the distribution, right? The peripheral distribution, they came out and they picked up this area of skin, in this case, the radial and axillary nerve, picked up this posterior part of your skin, and they innervated the muscles underneath them. So they were all sensory and motor, right? Because they're going to the same place. So that nerve had sensory and motor axons, and they were all kind of headed toward this area for the axillary nerve, and this one for the radial. Right? They branched off. So that was your spinal nerves. So in your spinal nerve, right, you had that sensory nuclei that was kind of taking care of the sensory information coming in from this one sometimes. And then you had the motor nuclei over here, the ventral horn motor nuclei, and then the lateral ones with the visceral, right? And it was a very simple kind of organization, then surrounded by white matter. Your brainstem is going to have something similar as far as the cranial nerve nuclei. You don't have to know any of this, by the way, but you'll know, instead of ventral horn motor nuclei and sensory nuclei, right, they'd be kind of spread out right over here, right? These are just the kind of equivalent of what you'd see instead of your spinal nerve covering your, the radial nerve or something, you'd have one covering your facial muscles or something like that in your brainstem. So there's the similarities there as far as what this, the organization goes. And if you really wanted to pay attention, you'd see that these were all, the motor ones are a little more ventral and the sensory ones would be more dorsal, right? So the organization would stay throughout the entire brain. And then we also looked at that clinical application, right? The dermatomes. Over here, this was shingles, right? This was a virus, right? A chickenpox virus, herpes zoster virus that was hanging out near dorsal root ganglia. And when you became stressed and stuff, it became activated and it caused that rash along where the patch of skin where it innervated, right? And that was like a visual manifestation of this.
It's 18h30.
Spinal nerve right here, right? So here's another one on the face over here, right? This lady has shingles on this side of her face, right? The left side over here in this very particular pattern, right? One side in a very clear line down here and in a very particular region of that. Here's another one over here, right? On the tongue, right? And all this is from your trigeminal nerve, right? In that case, the virus was hanging out in a trigeminal ganglia, one of the cranial nerves. And when it became activated, it traveled down the spinal nerve and then spread its nastiness down particular regions of the face right over there. Right. So this area, this is another dermatome just like these over here that's covered by a particular cranial nerve. Happens to be trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve number 5, which it's 3 divisions. Cranial nerve, you know, this is 1, 2, 3 of that, but they're covering the whole face just like these are. So in the case of this trigeminal nerve, it was acting a little like your spinal nerve in covering the skin, like picking up all the sensory information on your head versus your body. Right? So your cranial nerves, you know, you want to look at them sort of like your spinal nerves. They're really not too different, but there are going to be a couple of unique features about these versus your spinal nerves. All right, so your cranial nerves, your spinal nerves were all coming off the spinal cord, coming out that intervertebral foramen of the spinal cord, heading out toward the body. Your cranial nerves are going to come off your brainstem. And instead of going out, you know, to the rest of your body, they're going to go penetrate through your skull and then kind of cover all the skin and muscles and stuff on your face, as well as those special sensory things like your eyes, your ears, your vestibular organs and stuff like that. Right, so here is all those nerves, right? This is your spinal cord down here. The brain stem has been removed as well as the brain, and then they cut all the nerves that were coming off it. And then those cranial nerves would penetrate through the skull. Remember that internal acoustic meatus? I think you guys have to learn, like the optic canals, all those little holes in the skull, they were all coming from the brain and to the brain, right? All those nerves coming out. And then they're going to innervate all the structures of your head, muscles of your head, skin of your head, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the cranial nerves. And then there are nuclei. Again, don't worry about the details here. They're going to be spread throughout kind of a little more diffuse manner than you learned about in the spinal cord, but nuclei will be within the brainstem here. So as far as what you got to know is I'm a little less interested in the particular region, you know, of the nuclei and stuff, but what they innervate and what they do to them. So a picture like this at the end of the lecture right here will give you most of the information that you want to know, right, about what you have to know about these nerves right here. So you can see that, you know, the nerves are either coming in, like especially your special sensory stuff, or going out, controlling things like your eye muscles, your facial muscles, your jaw muscles, the skin on your face, right, your tongue muscles, your neck muscles. And then we're going to have your vagus nerve, which is going to, you know, be a special one that's going to go down into your thoracic and your abdominal cavity. All right, so I'm going to give you a couple of particular special examples. Again, these aren't in your slides because I don't want you to go too crazy with them, because, you know, your information is really not too much more than a slide like this or that slide that I had to tell you, right? But this is just to kind of give you an idea of a couple of the special ones. So your first cranial nerve is your olfactory nerve. That was coming right off your brain, right over there. It's actually part of your brain. It actually has direct connections to your brain rather than going through the thalamus, but basically its nerves dangle down into your nasal cavity, and they're embedded within the olfactory epithelium here, such that when you breathe things in, it picks up those odorant molecules and sends it up those olfactory nerves through the olfactory bulb to your brain right there. Right? So it's the sense of smell, and that's all it does. Unlike your spinal nerves, this nerve only has a sensory functions. There's no thing that's controlling your nose muscles, because really there is no nose muscles to speak of. All right, so this is a special sensory cranial nerve. Cranial nerve number 1. Cranial nerve number 8, we're jumping right to hearing now. Another special sensory one, sensory only. You don't have ear muscles, at least skeletal ones that we're aware of, right, that are covering your ear, right? This is cranial nerve number 8, and your auditory or vestibulocochlear that we talked about when we looked at the apparatus of the inner ear, right? It was picking up those signals from the cochlea or your vestibular organs and bringing them into the brain. Right? That was your cranial nerve number 8, sensory only, didn't have any motor function to it. And then your cranial nerve number 2, going back up, is your optic nerve. We've seen that, right? The back of the eyeball, you have the sensory receptors and then the nerves. They would, be at the back of the eyeball and they'd penetrate into the skull right here. Remember, they cross over to the other side and be interpreted in your occipital lobe after going through the thalamus. Because your optic nerve would be coming right off your eyeball right there. And again, sensory only, right? There's no motor function to this optic nerve, just picking up sensory information. So here it is again, right? This is the back of the eyeball right here with all the sensory receptors. Light comes in and then it stimulates them, and then it's bringing that information to the back of the head, cranial nerve optic. But you also may notice around the eyeball, these pink strips here, these are skeletal muscles that control your eye, voluntarily control your eye movement, up, down, sideways. Right? These are going to be controlled by these 3 cranial nerves, your oculomotor, your trochlea, and your abducens, 3, 4, and 6. 3, 4, and 6. Eye muscles. You don't have to know which particular eye muscles. They're just controlling your eye muscles, oculomotor, trochlea, and abducens. Right, so far we have the sensory stuff, and now from your eye, nose, and ears, and now we start to control these movements of your eyeball. And you can voluntarily look up or down and all stuff. This is skeletal muscle. So these are voluntary muscles or somatic motor neurons controlling these, right? Extraocular muscles. So that's 1, 2, and 7. And this is 3, 4, and 6. So what other kind of things are in your head? Well, there's all your facial muscles, your zygomatic major, your depressor anguli oris, right? All those facial expression muscles. These are going to be controlled by your facial nerve, cranial nerve number 7. And their function, oh, by the way, these didn't have any sensory function. They weren't doing any, there's nothing for them to sense. They were just controlling these eye muscles. They didn't have any sensory function like a spinal nerve might. Your cranial nerve number 7 is controlling the facial muscles, right? Making you smile, frown, do all that stuff. And that's the motor function of cranial nerve number 7, because it also, not shown here, also is going to have sensory functions, but it's not picking up the sensory information of your face like you might think. All right. It's cranial nerve number 7. What other muscles do we have in your head? I'm going to give you a second to think about it. We have your eye muscles here. And then we have your facial muscles. What's missing over here? Your mastication muscles, right? Those are going to be like your temporalis and your masseter muscle. Those are going to be controlled not by your facial nerve number 7, but cranial nerve number 5, the trigeminal. It's your biggest nerve, biggest cranial nerve. So that is going to control the muscles of your chewing muscles, right? As well as your pterygoid muscles. Right, so that's your trigeminal, and that's the motor function of cranial nerve number 5. Because if you remember a couple slides back, I talked about the trigeminal nerve and its innervation, the dermatomes on the face. So the motor function of your trigeminal is muscles of mastication. Sensory function of your trigeminal nerve is to cover basically almost all the skin on your face, right? Just like those dermatomes I showed you. All right, so cranial nerve number 5, trigeminal nerve is covering your face. So that's its sensory division. So your trigeminal is both motor and sensory, kind of like a spinal nerve, but it's not quite corresponding. Remember, your facial muscles are covered by cranial nerve number 7, but they don't cover your skin on your face like a spinal nerve might. Your trigeminal covers all the skin on your face. Okay. And I don't ask you about the particular divisions of any of that stuff. So again, here is the different divisions that cover the dermatomes on your face. And as I talked about with shingles, right? The herpes zoster or chickenpox virus hides out in your dorsal root ganglia. And then when it gets infected, it spreads out and it shows you the dermatomes of those particular regions of your trigeminal nerve, right? All right, so that is a mixed nerve, right? That has motor and sensory, cranial nerve number 5, or trigeminal. Another cranial nerve, a very important one, is one we will talk more about next lecture when we get to the parasympathetic of the autonomic nervous system, because your vagus nerve is about 75% of your parasympathetic output. That's cranial nerve number 10. And that one is up in your medulla, but its axons go down and innervate things like your bronchioles, your heart, your stomach, and stuff like that, right? So your vagus nerve is a major parasympathetic player, and we'll get back to it when we talk about the autonomic nervous system. It's another cranial nerve, very important. So those are just a couple of key examples, right? You want to look at the particular functions, just make a very brief note of what all your cranial nerves do. And, that is a little bit of memorization, but remember, you're going to have something that tells you on old Olympus's towering top, a fin and German viewed some hops, or whatever dirty one you think of, right? And then you're going to have to stick a name to that because there's 3 O's there. So this is olfactory, optic, oculomotor. And then you're going to have your trochlea. Remember, 3, 4, and 6 are the ones that are doing the muscle, or doing the eyeball. And they're named after the particular muscles, right? Oculomotor. Oculo means eye, motor means motor. Trochlea is a particular muscle, and so is abducens, right? When you're abducing your eye. So oculomotor, trochlea, and then the trigeminal is cranial nerve number 5, right? And abducens. And then facial nerve and auditory or vestibular cochlear for cranial nerve number 7, glossopharyngeal, vagus, spinal or spinal accessory, and your hypoglossal. So what names are in this, right? Olfactory means smell, optic means eye, oculomotor means eye, trochlea, well, if you happen to know that the trochlea muscle is in your eye, then you'll remember that's an eye one. Trigeminal doesn't really have any clue about it, but it does, it has a big functions, right? Mastication and sensory information face. Abducens, you think of moving your eye movement away from your, rather toward the lateral side. Your facial one is going to do your facial muscles, right, as well as have other functions. Your vestibular, cochlear, or auditory nerve, right, that's a special sensory one. Your glossopharyngeal, glosso, if you know that means tongue, that helps. Pharyngeal means your throat. So glossopharyngeal means it's controlling some of your tongue and throat muscles. And your vagus nerve is your vagus nerve. That's the big one. And your spinal accessory is basically a glorified spinal nerve. It does your trapezius and your sternocleidomastoid, your neck muscles. Going over there. And then your hypoglossal, glossal again means tongue, under your tongue, right? That's going to be also something that controls your tongue. So one thing, another function you want to remember, help you remember these, is this other one. This is, some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. What this means is sensory, motor, or both. Right, so these sensory ones, and really basically those special sensory, smell, vision, and hearing, are sensory only. And these ones with M's, marry, money, my, matter, more, are motor only. That is, they don't have a sensory component to them. And these both are both sensory and motor. Right, so that, you got to have that down, right? You got to remember these, some way to remember, some mnemonic to remember the names. And they're going to go in order from 1 to 12. And then this one will help you kind of give you a clue about sensory versus motor, right? And then the rest of the stuff will be things like very basic information, you know, like smell, see, you know, eyeball movement, eye movement. For this, chewing, and face, skin. For the big things, this is another eye movement. This is facial expressions. This one is hearing, as well as vestibular information. This is, I think you could just think tongue, as well as something else, which I'll talk about in a second. This, you just want to remember that it's your visceral motor component. That's the big thing to remember about the vagus. Even though it has other sensory stuff, the important part about the vagus is this visceral motor. And then this one is a neck muscles. And this one is, again, the tongue muscle, hypoglossal. So, you know, really that kind of level of information about their function is pretty much enough, with the exception of a couple of these ones that have stars on them, which is this one, this one, this one, and this one. And I have another one, I made this one up. Only 4 of your cranial nerves got visceral. That is, they have a visceral component to it versus somatic. And these are 3, 7, 9, 10. If you repeat that over a couple of times, 3, 7, 9, 10, you got to get that down, because it's a quick way to kind of, when you're taking multiple choice questions and you see the word visceral and cranial nerve, you're going to want to remember 3, 7, 9, 10. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about the autonomic nervous system. All right, so again, this kind of chart like this that's in your slides is basically pretty much the information that you have to know, with the exception of these 4, which I'll talk about, but it won't be any much more than something like this. Pupil dilation for smooth muscle around your eye. This is going to be salivary gland. This is going to be also salivary and tears. Right, these are going to be, and then this one, your, where'd it go? Vagus is going to be, your parasympathetic output, basically. And we'll learn, we'll get into more detail about that. Right, so that'll be the other kind of information. And we'll go into that next time, right? Vagus. Oh, here's another dumb way to remember this. 12 cranial nerves, if you want to remember, if you want to draw something like this. Right, this is a face over here. Right, here's his eyes, his eyebrows, his ears over here, nose, his mouth, his tongue. Right, so cranial nerve number 1 is the olfactory nerve. Number 2, your optic nerves in your eyeball. 3, 4, and 6. Son of a nutcracker. 3, 4, and 6 over here are controlling your eye muscles. Number 5, right? Remember it kind of covers a big region of your face, just like number 7 on the outside here also covers like all your facial muscles. Cranial nerve number 5 is doing the skin as well as the mastication muscles. And then number 8, right? Your hearing, auditory. Number 9 is your glossopharyngeal. Number 10 is your vagus. Going down here, 11, your neck muscles. Over here, and number 12, a glossopharyngeal. So if you could draw something like that, that's an easy, another dumb way to remember it. But dumb ways are the best ways to remember these things, because otherwise, every year, by the way, if I'm telling you cranial nerves, it's because I'm doing that dumb mnemonic in my head. Otherwise, I would forget it, even though I teach it 3 times, 6 times a year. Now 8 times a year. Learn something dumb like this and just have this ready to go and looking at questions to answer those. In the next video, I'll show you how to identify all those cranial nerves on an image such as this. All right, we'll see you next time.